So, it's been a little while since we've had a new 2D Zelda, over 10 years now, and in that time the series has changed pretty dramatically. The 3D games went from linear to completely open world, dropping just about every convention that the series had established. A lot of this change was necessary to help rejuvenate the series, but it also left a lot to be desired, specifically the dungeons and puzzles, which took more of a do-it-yourself type design that mirrored the open nature of the world. The puzzles went from having one solution to having just about any solution, and while this approach certainly encourages player freedom, it significantly lessens the complexity those puzzles can be designed with. While some people can find satisfaction out of making their own solutions, I am not one of those people, and I'd much rather have a puzzle that is designed around one solution, as it allows the process of reaching that solution to be much more complex and in-depth. Finding my own solution isn't satisfying if what I come up with just feels hacky, or like I'm breaking the game. Nintendo also seemed to have forgotten how dungeons should be designed too. A good dungeon is often an extension of the puzzles found within, with complex layouts that challenge a player's sense of space and force them to think about how solving individual puzzles can affect the greater whole. Of course, the dungeons in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom don't do this, and pretty much just act as a way to house individual puzzles that don't relate to each other in any way. I don't enjoy dungeons just for the aesthetic of being in a dungeon, and needless to say, I really don't like these dungeons because of that. So how does all of this relate to Echoes of Wisdom? Does it follow the path of previous 2D entries with a concise emphasis on dungeon and puzzle design? Well, no, not really. Actually, in many ways it feels like the Breath of the Wildification of 2D Zelda, which isn't a verb, but I'm a writer, so I can do these things. But what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, Echoes of Wisdom borrows pretty heavily from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's mechanics. You're given a way to levitate objects like with Magnesis or Ultra Hand, there's weather mechanics, an overabundance of warp points, automatons, you lose your map in a certain part of the desert, a cooking system, the final boss has scary hands that can grab you, and there's this stupid ball puzzle again. And that's just all off the top of my head, I'm sure there's more. Why are all of these mechanics back? Well, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom sold really well, so why not throw them in? But these returning mechanics aren't my main issue. In fact, I probably wouldn't even care that much if not for Breath of the Wild's dungeon design being brought over to this game as well. To be fair, the dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom are a definite improvement over Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdoms, and they do try to have more of the traditional dungeon design, but the player mechanics are so fundamentally broken that it ends up undoing almost any attempt the game makes at trying to create an interesting puzzle. The main gimmick of this game is that Zelda can create copies, or echoes, of objects in the environment, which includes things like rocks, pots, tables, decorative plants, and statues, just to name a few. It's an ability that instantly reminded me of Ultra Hand because of how overpowered it is, and sure enough, you can use it to cheese just about every puzzle in the game. Obviously, most of the puzzles are designed around this mechanic, but there are so many echoes in this game that any one puzzle can have like 5 different solutions, each of varying satisfaction. Here, you could create a path to lead these sparks into the box, or just grab them and put them in. Or, if you're feeling extra lazy, you could just kill one, copy its echo, and then place it directly inside of the box, which at that point, you're not even solving a puzzle anymore, just completing a task. Which of these 3 solutions is the intended one, or are they just all meant to be valid? I can't tell if the developers just wanted puzzles to have many solutions, or if they wanted the player to place an ungodly amount of restrictions on themselves to avoid breaking the game. But either way, I'd say it's just lazy design, and these types of puzzles can be found all throughout the game. What's worse is that some echoes are considerably better than others, specifically the bed, which is broken in multiple ways. I'm not kidding when I say that you can probably solve over 50% of the puzzles in this game using the bed in some way. It's the easiest way to cross gaps, one of the easiest ways to gain height and climb over something, and it's the easiest way to cross water, because it also floats. You could use a rock to block the wind here so that you don't fall off, or you could just go over it with the bed. You could go through a cave to get to the other side of a cliff, or you could stack some beds over to the other side. Even in this dungeon, you could go through multiple rooms to reach this switch, or you could just stack some beds up to this ledge and skip straight to it. It has so many applications, and that's not even mentioning its third function, but I'll get into that in a minute. I'm not going to act like making a bed staircase wasn't really cool at first, because it was, but when it becomes the solution for any gap that you can't just jump over, it gets really old really fast. The broken nature of these echoes has some pretty major ramifications on the dungeons as well, and where they can easily make for unsatisfying puzzles, they can just as easily make for unsatisfying dungeons. I think the best example I have of this was when I was playing through the ice dungeon. When I reached this room, I took a quick look at it and instantly thought, oh yeah, this is definitely possible with the echoes I have, and sure enough, it was. And then I walked into the next room just to find the actual solution to the puzzle I had just solved, effectively rendering the entire room useless. Even when the dungeon was trying to make a puzzle more complex and utilize multiple rooms, the game had already ingrained it into me that any puzzle could be cheated given enough experimentation. So much so that I didn't even notice the doorway to the room with the solution until after I had already solved the puzzle. But even if I wasn't able to solve this puzzle the wrong way, the actual solution still isn't that amazing either. Even if the puzzle does extend beyond a single room, the solution is literally just the next one over. I feel like one of the biggest missed opportunities with the dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom is how little they utilize their own mechanics. Let's take the ice dungeon again. Its central gimmick of being able to freeze and thaw out certain rooms is a really interesting idea, but the dungeon itself doesn't do enough with that idea to make it actually engaging. I think ideally, they should have done something similar to the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time or Eagle Tower in Link's Awakening, where you have to keep track of how you change the layout of the dungeon and continue to make changes depending on where you need to go. But the ice dungeon in Echoes of Wisdom doesn't really do this. Most of the time you'll just freeze or thaw a room once and then move on, and if the dungeon does require to flip between the two, it's an extremely simple task. In this room, you heat up the next room so that the icicles blocking the snowball melt, but then the snowball can't cross this gap of water, so you go back one room and freeze the previous room again so that the snowball can get across and hit the button. Pretty simple. I think this puzzle would probably work great as a way to introduce this concept to the player, and then expand upon it from there. But in actuality, it's literally the final puzzle of the dungeon. Only before the dungeon is nearly over does it even begin to scratch its own potential, and I think just about every other dungeon in the game has this exact same problem. The only one that really stood out to me was Farron Temple. It's nothing spectacular, but it is very solid, and I distinctly remember it being the most fun part of the game for me. A lot of its puzzles were not nearly as easy to break, and its more complex layout even left me a bit lost at times while I was exploring it, which was a great feeling. However, it's a feeling that the game is far too afraid to consistently give you. There were several instances where I would find a room with multiple paths, and I would excitedly go down one of them wondering where it would take me, only for it to lead to a useless reward and a dead end, funneling me back out of the room and towards the main path. Linear dungeons aren't always a bad thing, and there are several instances across the series where they make it work, but this isn't one of them, and it just feels more hand-holding than anything else. This is unfortunately also true of Echoes of Wisdom's Water Dungeon, which is literally just another Breath of the Wild dungeon, and it is unsurprisingly the worst one in the game. This is 2 in a row now, and I'm starting to think that the universe might be playing a joke on me. But outside of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's influence, Echoes of Wisdom has its own unique issues that consistently bothered me as well, and it's all an extension of how little this game seems to know what it actually wants. There are so many ideas presented here, but the game doesn't commit to any single one of them, and as such, none of them are done particularly well. This is the first mainline game in the series where you get to play as Zelda, and yet the developers felt the need to also let you transform into Link. Like they're so dependent on his existence that they literally can't make a mainline game where you don't play as him in any way. The combat in this game is just really underdeveloped in general, and while the ability to summon enemies is really cool, there's nothing in the game to keep this system in check. You know how in like any game where you can play as a summoner, you have to efficiently manage your mana consumption so that you don't run out of summons and die? Well, not in Echoes of Wisdom. While there's only a certain amount of objects or enemies that you can summon at a time, there's absolutely nothing to stop you from spamming the same monster over and over again every time it dies. This pretty much renders about 90% of enemy summons in the game completely worthless, because if there's literally no punishment for summoning your best monster every time, then why wouldn't you take advantage of that? I used 2 summons for my entire playthrough, this Bokoblin with a shield for the first half of the game, and then this giant Dark Nut for the rest of the game once I could summon him. Every other enemy I used only for specific occasions, if I even used them at all. I tried summoning multiple enemies a couple of times, but I eventually stopped because I got sick of trying to navigate this awful slide menu that they brought over from Tears of the Kingdom. I just left the sword on recently used and kept doing what I already knew worked. I'm not asking for Sekiro levels of depth in the combat, but being forced to spend more than a single thought on any combat encounter would be greatly appreciated. The addition of the lock-on mechanic also leaves a lot to be desired as well, as it brings with it all of the issues it has in the 3D games, plus more. When there are multiple enemies in the room, it can be hard to target the one that you actually want to fight, and on top of that, the game also lets you lock onto objects as well. I'm not saying this shouldn't be a mechanic, but when there are enemies in a room, the last thing I want to target is a rock. There needs to be some level of priority. Another reason why the combat, and even the difficulty of the game, doesn't work is yet again because of beds. Because for some reason, they can just auto-heal you while you sleep on them. But it doesn't end there either, because you can get even better beds that'll heal you more, and then you'll get an outfit that'll heal you more still. But if you really want to maximize your nap profits like the Sigma Giga Chad that you are, then you can flop up and down on beds like a fish to speed up the healing process. This mechanic is so broken that I literally fought the final boss by sleeping in a bed while my Summon and Link beat it for me.
You've killed me!
Good.
Another aspect of Echoes of Wisdom that I feel is only half complete is its companion character, Tri. Tri really feels like a placeholder companion to me. Like, the idea and character arc of the companion are there, but the game does barely anything with it. Like, there are little moments here and there where they imply character development is happening, but these moments are so few and short that they become completely insignificant. And by the time Tri inevitably has to leave Zelda at the end of the game, you literally don't care because there was hardly ever even a character there in the first place. In my case, I was actually glad to see them go. Their tendency to tell you things that you literally just saw, and for stopping the game to give you the solution to puzzles, made me really, really dislike them. The story in Echoes of Wisdom is just so generic and boilerplate in general. Nintendo really needs to get off their asses and hire a couple of actual writers. Well, how about the world design and exploration? Is that at least good? I mean, kinda. I think the best part of the world is just exploring it, and because of how open everything is, I spent a lot of time at the start of the game just wandering around, discovering little secrets in towns. Unfortunately though, a lot of the activities that can be done out in the world end up becoming pretty tedious as the game goes on, especially these smaller rifts that you can jump into. The task you're given inside of them is always the exact same. Find an X amount of important points to free Tri's friends, and then you're done. The depth of this activity remains stagnant throughout the entire game, and while they do offer a valuable reward, once you've seen them enough times, they just aren't interesting anymore. The same thing can also be said of the side quests, the vast majority of which are just simple fetch quests for echoes. And a lot of times you'll already have the echo someone is looking for, turning the side quest into an extreme challenge of patience as you sift through your inventory. Oh, god damn it, I missed it! And finally, there's the caves, which have been almost entirely stripped of their valuables and are now mostly unrewarding. There were so many times where I would go through a cave and the only thing I'd get out of it were rupees, or worse, ingredients, which can also just as easily be found by breaking boxes. I've no idea why any of these would be placed behind a cave or puzzle. It's always extremely disappointing. You'd think there'd be some heart pieces in these caves, and occasionally there are, but most of them are just kinda sitting out in the open for some reason. Though that being said, I didn't find all the heart pieces anyway, because I got pretty bored playing the game near the end. What also doesn't help the exploration is that half of Echoes of Wisdom's map is literally just a link to the past again, making this the second time in a row that the Zelda team have reused this map for their new 2D game. But unlike A Link Between Worlds, this wasn't marketed at all, and I honestly find it to be pretty lazy. If the developers can come up with new areas around the side of the map, then they can come up with something new for the center of the map too. Another facet of the map that I particularly don't like is its overabundance of warp points, a decision that's so overly convenient it feels like it was made specifically for game journalists. This issue also extends to the dungeons as well, and it completely alters how they're experienced. There's nothing wrong with getting lost in a dungeon, and not being able to warp anywhere at any time makes that experience more immersive. Obviously, not all warps are bad, but there doesn't need to be one slapped down in every other room. I think the way it's handled in Link's Awakening is much better. The same thing is also true of the overworld. Yes, there should be a few warp points around the map so that getting to places isn't a complete slog, but they don't need to be placed this aggressively. There are even two that are so close to each other, it only takes about 10 seconds to walk between them. What's even more ironic is that they're placed between a horse stable. Like, seriously, why would you ever use a horse to travel in this game when there are so many warp points available? The final big issue this game has is related to hardware, specifically the frame rate. Stutters are pretty frequent, especially in more visually heavy areas, but even in areas with less going on in them, the game will still struggle to keep up. The worst I experienced was during the final boss, where it momentarily dipped to around 20 frames per second. I'm not expecting the game to be perfectly lagless, but to the degree it's present in Echoes of Wisdom is pretty unacceptable, and I can't help but wonder if Nintendo's solution to this will just be for people to play it on the Switch 2 instead. Alright, I've been pretty harsh so far, and before I wrap this video up, I want to say some things I like about the game too. Visually, the game looks great, and there's tons of beautiful lighting and ambient effects throughout the world. I always thought that everything looked a bit too plastic in the Link's Awakening remake, and I never really felt that in Echoes of Wisdom, though I could also just be completely used to it by now. All of the movement issues in the Link's Awakening remake have been smoothed out as well. There's now a dedicated jump button rather than it being an item, and Zelda can move in all 360 directions rather than awkwardly snapping to 8. The movement feels so good now that it's genuinely going to make going back to the Link's Awakening remake a little bit harder. While Echoes of Wisdom lacks a lot of the dungeon design I liked from previous entries, its music is thankfully just as on point, and is a welcome return after 2 games with mostly ambient soundtracks. There's a lot of great material here, from the peppy overworld theme, the Royal Castle Town, and a pretty silly Goron Village theme. But my favorite track is probably Hyrule River. It's really beautiful. I really like how little this game relies on the music from other games. It's mostly all unique, with just a few cameos from songs like the Hyrule Castle theme from A Link to the Past, and obviously Zelda's theme. However, all of these aspects of the game that I really like are pretty supplemental. They can only add to an experience that is already enjoyable. I'm sorry I've been so critical as of late, but the bottom line is that I fundamentally didn't gel with this game. I lost a lot of interest a little over halfway through, and truthfully, the only reason I even finished it was because I paid $60 for it, and it had the word Zelda in the title. If you're a really big fan of the Breath of the Wild type of Zelda games, then you'll probably enjoy this one. But if you're like me, and you want a game with more depth in its puzzles, and a greater focus on concise exploration, then I'd recommend you look for something else. The final big issue this game has is unfortunately related to hardware. Don't use hair.